welcome to day 117 of Bible 365 with Kathy Carter. If you have never been in Bible 365 with Kathy Carter, who's me, I want you to listen. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. And then I want you to go back to the beginning and start at Genesis 1. I am reading through the Bible every day for 365 days, 1 year. And I'm using the 1 Year Chronological Bible reading plan, which is online at the 1 Year Chronological Bible online.com. As soon as I started this video, my dog insisted on drinking water. So that is going to be what you hear in the background. It's not like a water feature. Today is day 117, which means we're 117 days in. On the calendar, it's going to say April 26th. So if you started at January 1st, today is April 26th. You might be in front of me, which means that you have to hold on to your reading. You might be behind me, right? So you may have started at a different time. So I don't want you to stress out about the date. It's really just to let you know. I had a request that said, they're listening and they want to know what day it's supposed to be. So if you are listening and you kind of want to stick with the dates, then just so you know where we are. April 26th. So our reading today is 1 Chronicles, and this isn't necessarily the order it's in. It's just the order that it's easiest for me to tell you. 1 Chronicles 21, 14, 3 through 7, 3, 5 through 9, and then 2 Samuel 11 to 12, 14, 5, 14 through 16, and then Psalm 51. It sounds like a major reading, but it's not really quite as big as you think. And some of it repeats itself. So that's one of the things that we notice with, if you've been reading, hopefully you'll notice between 1 Chronicles and 1 and 2 Samuel, right? So a lot of this is David's story, which is what we're going to say. Chronicles, if you have never read this book before, it's written by a chronicler. So somebody who's actually telling the stories of the things that happened to the Israelite people. So they start with a lot of genealogy and then they move on from there. And so we're going to see a huge span of time in the book of Chronicles. And then 2 Samuel, the writer is probably not too far behind this scenario happening. Maybe they're writing it during the entire time that it is happening. And so, because we see that they appointed a recorder a couple of days ago, we see that they appointed a recorder, which means they're recording the things that are happening. And so they might be recording it through time. And then this is just sort of a revealing of what's happening through time. Okay. And then of course, Psalms is, it's poems, it's music, however you want to do it. And there are several different writers, but at this period, this is the Psalms that David has been writing. So depending on the situation that David is in. All right, so we are with King David. King David has settled in his kingdom. He is now king over all of Israel. So if you have never known the Bible before, you probably have heard of King David. He has led the Israelite people successfully. The Lord has appointed him over the people of Israel. And so he loves the Lord and he kind of lifts everything up to the Lord. And what we see is he has unified the people through God. Of course, God has unified the people through David. And so now we're going to see what happens. He's coming to a different place now. It's a little bit slightly more of a peaceful time because he had to take over for Saul. And so he had to bring everybody kind of into line. And now we find ourselves in 1 Chronicles 20. So starting in 1. So 1 Chronicles 20 and 2 Samuel 1, or I'm sorry, 2 Samuel 11:1 are really similar. Not exactly the same, but really similar. So I'm just going to read the first sentence. It says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, Joab led out the armed forces. So right away, we see a couple of things. The first thing is that Joab is leading. Now, if you remember who Joab is the leader of the army. David is usually the one that is leading because David is the leader of the people. He's the leader of Israel. He has been the one who's been leading people to war. We see when David went in, people would flee, right? David is their leader. He's the one that God has appointed. And yet it's spring, and normally kings are out and they're at war, which in and of itself seems weird. That why would springtime be when people go to war? But I guess it's because it's not too cold, not too hot. But it's spring, and Joab is leading out. Joab lays waste to the Ammonites. And so it's not that he's not winning these wars, right? Joab is doing a great job. The Lord is with the people of Israel. It says, but David remained in Jerusalem. So David is the king, and he's staying back in Jerusalem. So there has been a time, again, sort of peace. And so David is hanging back and letting his first in command do the job. So while he's here and not at war with his men, verse 2 in 2 Samuel, it says, one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. So this is a relatively famous story. David sees a beautiful woman called, and her name, he finds out her name. So he's in a time of rest. I guess he's relatively confident. I mean, I shouldn't probably say what he feels like, but he didn't need to go out to war. So I'm going to say contextually, it seems like maybe he's pretty confident. Joab's going to do what he's been put on duty to do. The Lord is with their people, and Joab's going to win these battles. And so David's kind of chilling, and he goes up on his roof. When he goes up on his roof, he sees a woman bathing. That's all we hear, is he sees a woman bathing. So I want to note that we don't want to add anything to the text. We don't want to take away from it either, of course, because again, going all the way back, this is a point that I'm probably going to keep making, going all the way back. This is what Eve did. Eve both added and took away, right? So we have to be really, really careful that when we look at this, we don't add or take away with the stuff that God is giving us. So we just have to kind of deliver what we've got. So the woman was very beautiful. That's at this point, all we know about her is that she's bathing. David's looking at her and she's very beautiful. So then he sends someone to find out about her. And when he sends her to find out about her, the guy finds out this information. Her name is Bathsheba. She's the daughter of Eliam, and she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So she is a married woman, and she's married to one of David's mighty men. So if you guys remember way back when, I mean, I guess it wasn't that far back, maybe a week ago, they made a big point of writing down all of these mighty men that came to David. Now, he wasn't one of the top 3 that like slayed 800 people with his sword, or right, like any of those kind of things, but he was one of the 30. He was named in there as one of David's mighty men. So he is he can probably lead by himself. He's certainly great in battle, and he's somebody who has been with David for a very, very long time. So he was with David not when David just became king of Israel, but before that. So I'm again contextually trying not to add anything. It feels as though there was probably some kind of relationship between David and Uriah, right? Like he definitely knew who he was. There's no kind of thinking that he didn't know. So this is a wife of somebody that was in his army that he knew, that was one of his mighty men, that was pointed out in scripture as one of the mighty men. We don't necessarily hear about any of these others, but we do hear about Uriah. All right, so it says that so then in verse 4, it says, David sent messengers to get her. So as king, he goes and he gets her and he brings her to his place. And it says she came to him and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. So I just want to note this because this is, I'm going to show you, this is the NIV version, right? And there's a point that I'm telling you this. This is the NIV version. It's also the 1 Year Chronological, which means I'm reading it in order. But this says, I have to read it again. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Not every version says that. And so this is one of the things that I wanted to look up, because I thought it felt a little out of context, right? So like, what does that have to do with anything? And it could have to do with, so I want to be fair, it could have to do with the woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I'm pregnant. So we could note like, okay, we recognize this is not her menstrual time, right? She purified herself and then obviously she's pregnant. Or the reason she was taking a bath was because she was purifying herself because it was her uncleanness, her menstrual cycle. So I want to note that there is that possibility, right? So I don't want to take away from that. But I also want to note that in the NASB, it looks as if, the NASB, the New American Bible Standard, New American Standard Bible, in the NASB version, which is semi sort of a word for word version. It doesn't mean it's right or better or any of those things. So I don't want to say that. But they try to keep it a little more word for word instead of thought for thought. So sometimes it might be a little more difficult to understand. It doesn't say that. It says after she purified herself. And so the difference could be that she purified herself after David took her and had sex with her. She purified herself after, right? So she may have been doing a cleaning ritual because she deemed herself unclean for having sex with David. So I want to note that. So this one clearly says it's from her menstrual cycle, from her monthly uncleanness. The other one I think is a little less clear. It looks like she's purifying herself after he took her. So I just want to note that there could be two, and someone else might go, oh, there could be a whole bunch more, whatever. But I just want to note that there could be a distinction between that. That to me, it looks like she's cleaning herself from being with David, but to others, it might look like she's cleaning herself from her monthly cycle. Throwing that out there, just so there's maybe it's a little bit of a different perspective. So, needless to say, he's the king. He brought her in as one of his people, right? He's the king over Israel, and he brought her in. And then David, so then he finds out she's pregnant. So then he comes up with this scheme. So David then sends word to Joab, who's the leader at the time, and he's the leader of the army, and he says, "Listen, I want you to send Uriah home." And so Joab goes, he sends Uriah home for a time. And when he comes home, David is like, hey, congratulations, go home to your wife. Well, that night, Uriah doesn't go home to his wife. He sleeps with the men, not sleeps with, literally sleeps with the men, all the servants outside, because he is a servant. So he sleeps with all the men outside. And then David's kind of frustrated, and it's because he was told he didn't go home. And then Uriah says to David, the ark and Israel, this is in verse 11, Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents. How could I go to my house and eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. So whatever we want to make about that, he believes that the ark, which is where God is, Israel, which is the people, and Judah. So Israel and Judah are sort of different kingdoms. Israel is most of the tribes. Judah is the tribe of Judah. And so he says that they are sleeping in tents, right? And that's basically the men that are off at war. They're sleeping in tents. And so he can't do any different because that's really where he's supposed to be. So then David convinces him to stay one more day, tries to get him drunk so he'll go home and be with his wife. And he chooses not to do that. He ate and drank, made him drunk, but he still went out and he slept among the servants. So then in the morning, because that didn't work, right? So he's like, okay, I'm going to try and get him to sleep with his wife. So they think that she's pregnant by Uriah. That doesn't work. And so then he says, he sends Joab to get him killed. So I'm going to give you sort of the longer version. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, the leader of the army, and sent it with Uriah. So he sends this particular letter against Uriah with Uriah. In it, he wrote, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is the fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die. So he gives this letter to Uriah, signing his very own death sentence. Uriah goes and hands this to Joab, who's the leader of the army. And then Joab has to put Uriah, who is a mighty man, who is strong in battle, who is really good for them as for winning the wars. And he goes and he takes this man and he puts this man in front of the fiercest battle. And then they all withdraw and they leave. And then Uriah winds up dying in the fight. So I think it's the Ammonites wind up killing him. So he's now in some ways committed murder. I want to say in some ways he's committed murder. God says he's committed murder. So in verse 18, then Joab sends David a full account of the battle. And then he tells the messenger, so he reminds the messenger of this account that happened that we actually already learned not that long ago. Verse 21, it says, so he says, listen, go tell David. He sends a messenger. He says, go tell David, I put him up at the front. You lost some men and Uriah died as well. And he says, if he says to you, who killed, why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbesheth? Didn't a woman drop a millstone from him on the wall so he died? Why did you get so close? So this was that area a few days back that they went into the stronghold and they climbed up in the stronghold and they were trying to stay safe. And then a woman killed this guy in battle. She dropped a millstone from his head and then the leaders wound up dying from that. And then David wound up taking the stronghold because of that. So they would have known better than to go and go to this battle. So to throw out possibilities, Uriah takes his own letter that has his own death warrant on it, hands it to Joab, and then Uriah goes to this stronghold that he knows has killed leaders in battle before. So he recognizes that this is not, he probably would, as being a mighty man and probably really good in battle, he would probably recognize that something was wrong. And yet he went into battle anyway. So he didn't question, we don't have any proof that he questioned Joab, or he said he wasn't going to go in, or he said this was a bad battle, or any of those things. He went into battle. So he went home, he followed what his leader told him to do. He did what David asked him to do. Now, I hate, we can only go with context. It feels to me as if he followed his leader. He loved David, he trusted David, and he followed David, possibly knowing he was going to die, possibly knowing that something was wrong, he was going to die. We don't know that for sure. Joab, however, we know Joab knows exactly what's going on, because the way that Joab says, hey, I just want you to note that if you're going to come and ask me and come at me and say, why would you send him there? Uriah died in this, right? So he knows that David set up Uriah to be murdered, obviously by the letter. He knows that David set up Uriah to be murdered. He might not know why yet, but he knows that he set Uriah up to be murdered. So he's kind of like, in some ways, hedging his bets, like, hey, I'm just letting you know, if you come after me, I'm going to come after you. I know that this is where you sent Uriah. So the messenger goes out and he tells David. And then in verse 25, David says to Joab, don't let it upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab. So he's confirming that he knows, but he's just being so comfortable with it, right? Like just so lackadaisical about the death of, because it wasn't just Uriah that died. Uriah wasn't alone. It was other men that died in this battle as well. These were men that depended on David. And up to this point, we see that David loves the Lord. David follows the Lord. He honors the Lord. He recognizes the worthiness of the Lord. He cries out to him when he needs help. And so this is a pretty rough place for David to be in. And even somebody who follows David or who loves David, I would imagine that this would be really, really hard to watch as the leader of his army, knowing all the things that he's done in the past. As a matter of fact, Joab, I believe, was cursed, and his family line was cursed because he took out Abner, because David was so honoring of the Lord and the anointing of the Lord. So, verse 26, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, they don't even give her a name at this point. We know her name is Bathsheba. They don't call her a name. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife, and then bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. So the Lord knows what he did. The Lord looks down, and he's displeased with David. David is being dishonoring to the Lord. So then he's going to send Nathan. We're in 2 Samuel 12. Verse 1, the Lord said to Nathan, or the Lord sent Nathan to David. So if you guys remember that Nathan is the one that came after Samuel. Samuel was the prophet, and Nathan came after Samuel as a prophet. And Nathan goes to David and tells him this little story. So he says, there were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle. The poor man had nothing except one ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it. It grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. So he had this like little girl lamb, and he loved her, and he took care of her. And she, like, imagine that your most amazing pet, you love this pet. And like this guy next to you, he's got so many, he doesn't even know the names of them, right? And so you love and you care for this one, and he's got all of these others. And so then it says a traveler came to the rich man. So the rich guy who has all these lambs and stuff, somebody came to visit him. And to feed him, he doesn't take any of his own. So he's got, let's say, 200. He doesn't take any of his own, but he goes and he takes that ewe lamb that belongs to the poor man, and he kills it and prepares it for the traveler to eat. So he takes from this guy something that's not his own. He has abundantly, but he takes from the guy who has almost nothing, and he shares it with other people. And so this is how, Nathan's telling the story as if this really happened, right? So he's coming sort of like as a judge. Verse 5, it says, David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. So he must be cursed, must die. Maybe cursed is the wrong word, but he must die, and then he pays for probably not after he dies, but he must pay 4 times over. So he's got to give back more than he took. And this would also coincide with the rules that God gives way back when, right? If you take something from your neighbor, you got to give back twofold, right? So he's saying not even twofold, he's saying 4 times. So he's like, this man owes him so much. So then Nathan says, because Nathan is a prophet, and he says, you are this man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king. I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave the master's house to you, your wives to you. I gave you all of Israel and Judah. And if this had not been enough, I would have given you even more. God's like, I gave you everything. I handed, and no one's going to say it was easy, right? We remember David lived in caves and Saul was chasing after him and all these kinds of things. But he's in this place that he's in right now. And the Lord has given him more than anyone needs to be happy. Just think of what you have when you look around your house. Like, just think of all the things that you have. It's probably, maybe not always, right? Maybe not for everyone. So obviously I want to be careful, but it's probably more than you need. And yet there's something in your heart that says that you want and need more. I want to point out something here too, and I want to be semi sort of careful about this because this is just one of those cherry pick things. So when I say cherry pick, I mean someone will like pluck a verse completely out of context and be like, see, what about this? Well, what, God's racist and God hates women and God, right? Like all these things. And so I just want to pluck this out. And there is a line in here, a verse in here that says, I gave your master's house to you, Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. And so the question, of course, here is, oh my goodness, God gave David all of those wives. Does that mean God supports, loves, condones, is for polygamy? And I want to be really careful in that. So I'm going to give you what I believe is my opinion based on what I have read through scripture. We might see more of this kind of stuff coming up, but I want to note what I've seen up to this point. I'm going to say no, that God does not support, condone, love polygamy, right? I'm going to say that is not his perfect image. And going back to Genesis, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds in this, but going back to Genesis, he made one man and he made one woman. And so that was what he deemed good. And so that was what he wanted. There are circumstances under which this world was what it was, right? Like men had kings. Let's just go with kings. Kings conquered territory and they married or took the women that were married to those other kings, right? There was plunder, there was spoil. And in a lot of those cases, the women were that. And obviously we see in Genesis as well that there have been multiple wives with some of these men. Does that mean I think that that's what God wants? And I'm going to say no. And I'm going to say contextually, right? So in the context of this particular area, God's point is, I gave you everything. And if you wanted more, because I loved you and because you honored me, I would have given you more. It doesn't mean I think you're supposed to have 1,000,000 wives. I think you're supposed to be rich. God makes you rich as long as you're a good person or you follow him or any of those things. I don't think we can, should, or in any way are supposed to take any of those things from these verses. These verses are to David and to David alone. And so there's other stuff that we're supposed to be taking out of it. Okay. So I want to kind of put that in there because I feel like I don't want to not touch any of these passages. I know some of the hard passages, I don't want to, kind of shy away from those. And I feel like God is not always as clear as we think he is, but in this very instance, he's talking to David. David was king. David had a position. The world looked a certain place when David had a position. And I'm not saying that God caters to the world because that also would be ridiculous. But in this position at this time, he said, I gave you these things so that, right? So everyone would know that you have taken over the entire nation for Saul, right? You are the leader of these people. And that is why God gave him all of those things, not because he wants men to have many wives, right? Not because he condones, wants, or loves polygamy. Okay, so moving aside from all that, I want to go into the fact that he gave him all of these things, and he said, if you wanted more, I would give them to you, right? When you're honoring God, God loves to love his people. And again, that doesn't mean boats or more TVs or more cars, or right? It doesn't necessarily mean any of those things. David honored him, and whatever David needed, God was there for him to give it to him. God, it was his ultimate go to in all things. And in this situation, he did not go to God. He dishonored God by taking something that was not his. Bathsheba was somebody else's. Bathsheba was Uriah's. And David took it and never consulted God about it, right? He knew what he did, and he knew he did the wrong thing, and he did it anyway because he was able to in the position that he was in. And so that's the in some ways the takeaway that we want to walk away with, that we're constantly in this position where we feel like we need to have what we don't have. We are not satisfied with what we have. And I see it myself. Like I see even in the church that I'm in, or in some groups that I'm in, or I see other people are doing this, or people are going to that person, or people love and honor that person, or that person's running a group that has 40 people, whatever it is, right? And I go, I want that. And what am I willing to do to take that? And why do I need that when I already have what God has given me? And so there's this desire for contentment in what God has placed in front of you, and to honor it, and to recognize that God has given it to you. And if you desire more and it's in God's will to do so, then ask God for it, right? So I feel like that might be a better takeaway than trying to find these laws in here that says, oh, well, then that means that I can take so-and-so's house, right? Like, so we just want to be careful, or I should have all these things, right? So anyway, so moving on from that, it says, because David did this, he is going to be punished for it. So it says, why did you despise the Lord? Now, if I'm going down to verse 9, sorry. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? So the word of the Lord, the things that the Lord said, and he did the opposite of that. And so he did what was evil in his eyes. You struck down Uriah the Hittite with a sword, even though he didn't, but he did because God knows his heart, and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. Again, we still really haven't named her yet. Again, we've heard her name, but she's just, at this point, in some ways, I hate to say this, but in some ways she's property. She's something that was taken. There was supposed to be a time of peace for David. And because of this, there will not be peace, right? He was coming to a place where there was going to be peace. And unfortunately, he turned from the Lord, right? You remember, we're supposed to be looking forward, not to the right, not to the left. We're supposed to be aiming forward and keeping our eyes on God. And he did not. His eyes looked somewhere where they didn't belong. So now he says, this is what the Lord says: out of your household, I'm going to bring calamity on you. So it's going to come up and out of his household. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives, give them to the one who's closest to you. He's going to sleep with them in broad daylight. So everything that you did in secret, I'm going to do in broad daylight before all of Israel. So Israel's going to know you did this at night. You hid it, right? You tried to cover it over and do all these things. Now I'm going to do this. I'm going to punish you, and everybody's going to know about it. So the things you try and hide, I'm going to pull out into the daylight. Verse 13, it says, David says to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replies, the Lord has taken away your sin. So there is some grace to this. David recognizes what he did. Obviously, you see his reaction when he thought it was something as simple as a lamb. He recognized that he really, really, really jacked up, and he really hurt his relationship with the Lord. He seeks forgiveness for it. I've sinned against you. And the Lord takes away his sin. This is the beauty of us living in this world, that when we sin, we recognize our sin, whether it be through somebody else, right? You might need someone to tell you. But when we sin and somebody lets us know, or we figure it out, or whatever it is that we do, because we all do. I don't want to take anything away from that. The Lord is gracious to take it away when we give it to him. You don't want to sit in it. You don't want to keep covering it. You don't want to excuse it, right? We love to excuse our sin. Well, I did that, but it was because this person did that to me. And it's a dangerous game to play. And we don't see that David plays that. David gives it over to the Lord, and the Lord takes it away from him. However, that's not the end, because these things are still going to happen to him. He doesn't say, okay, well, I'm going to take away the calamity now that you apologized. He doesn't say that. That calamity is still going to happen. And then it says, you're not going to die because you recognize your sin against me. But because by doing this, you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. So Bathsheba is pregnant. Obviously, we saw that already. And the son she's going to have is going to die. So he finds this out, and now we see Psalm 51, which I could talk about for an hour and a half, but I'm already at 30 minutes. All right, so he is obviously broken in spirit by this. He is seeking forgiveness. He is repenting, and he knows that his son is going to die. He also recognizes calamity is going to come from out of his house. So good things are not coming to him in the near future. Verse 1, it says, have mercy on me, O God. And then it says in verse 2, wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. So he's not just giving it over or forgetting it or being like, what's the big deal? So when we do things like, oh, I lied, I'm so sorry, right? He's like, cleanse me, wash me from this. Get rid of it, right? Get it away from me. Wash me from this so I can be clean in your sight again, Lord. Remember, cleanliness was huge in Israel. Cleaning before coming to the Lord was really, really important. And then he says, I know my transgressions and my sin is always before me. So he's seeing the depth of his sin. Against you and only you I've sinned, I've done evil. You are right in your verdict. So he's like, I don't even want to take away. This isn't like Job, where Job was like, he didn't realize that I didn't sin, or right. Like David's like, you're right. I deserve this. I've done terrible. So there's like a humility in this, in his recognition. In verse 6, he says, you desired faithfulness even in the womb. So he's like, I was sinful at birth, right? Like, again, some recognition there. But he said, you desire. So God doesn't leave it at that. So even though you can sit back and you can say to yourself, or you can say to everybody, like, oh, we all sin. Don't say it like that, because it doesn't say that. It says that God desires faithfulness even in the womb. So although we are sinful, God's like, I desire you to be faithful to me. I tell you all these things. I want you to be faithful to me. And David recognizes that. So he's cleansed. He says, cleanse me. And then in verse 10, create in me a pure heart, renew. So I have strayed. Bring me back, renew me, restore me, grant me a willing spirit, because I might be in this place where I'm like, oh, I don't want, right? Like, especially when calamity is going to start to come, how am I going to respond? Renew me and restore me, bring me back to you. Then after all this, I'm going to teach transgressors the same thing. So I'm going to look at them knowing I did it, and I'm going to look at those transgressors, and I'm going to teach them your ways, right? So that sinners turn back to you. So when somebody looks like me and they mess up and they feel like it is so bad that they can never do good, I'm going to turn them back to you, because I'm going to be like, look at me. Look at what happened to me. Look how bad I transgressed. You forgave me and you renewed my spirit. You cleansed me to be with you again. And I feel like that's like, what else could we ask for? That's not in here. That was just me thinking, like, what else could we possibly ask for? You're my God, my Savior. All right, moving on to 15. He says, open my mouth, open my lips. I'm going to declare this praise to you. My sacrifice. I know you don't want any, burnt offerings or any of those things. I'm not just going to come and do a ritual with you. My sacrifice is my broken spirit. So my sacrifice is this, we use this word so often, and I know I've mentioned it before, humility we use all the time. Oh, I'm so humble. And yet we're not. We're so proud inside. And I joke about it in some ways, that like sometimes on the outside I show humility, but on the inside or like I sit down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside, and I'm still like, I'm still being prideful. And all of that needs to go away. All of that needs to say, I am not worthy to be sitting in front of you. And yet you still love me enough to clean me, right? That has to be inside the heart. That can't just be words that come out of my mouth, because none of that matters. He sees what's in the heart. And then he says, please, may it please you to prosper Israel, so he doesn't forget his people. Build up the walls of Jerusalem and delight in our sacrifices. So he even recognizes as a leader, he's kind of messed some stuff up for Israel. And so he's like, please, let's just bring all of these people back into your graces so you will lift up Israel again. All right, so moving on from this, trying to get to these last couple of minutes. Verse 15, we're back in 2 Samuel 12. After Nathan went home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had born to David, and he became ill. So this baby is now sick. And, as the story reader, we know what's going to happen because God has already promised that this child is going to die. But what David doesn't just go, oh, well, the child's going to die. The baby is sick, and David prays and he fasts and he begs the Lord to save this baby, right? Because God is God and you just don't know, right? Like, yes, God said, this is what's going to happen. But there also might be times where he says, I see your repentant heart and I know that you have changed. And therefore, I'm going to give you this gift, right? So a lot of it could be what's going on internally in David. So David continues to pray. And I'm saying this because the people are like, the son winds up dying. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, he's been freaking out. Now I don't even know how to approach him, right? The servants don't know how to approach him and say he died. But David's like, did the child die? He gets his clothes back on, right? He eats, he cleans, right? He does all the cleanliness rituals and all these things. And so he says in verse 22, because they're like, why are you acting like that? In verse 22, it says, while the child was still alive, I fasted and I wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, I should not go on fasting. Can I bring him back? Right? So he's like, I begged for him, but God's will be done. I can't bring him back from the dead. Eventually I will be with him. And so there's some, in some ways, some contentment with the Lord did what the Lord did due to what David did. And so there's contentment and in some ways peace in there. And so then we go on. And so, of course, he then winds up marrying Bathsheba. So here we go. Now we see her name. Verse 24. David comforts his wife Bathsheba. He went to her. He was with her again. She bore a son to him, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him. And because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan to name him Jedediah. So they changed his name, although we mostly see him called Solomon. But the Lord calls him Jedediah. And then we go now. In this time, he had more kids. Solomon was one of them. Bathsheba wound up having 4 sons. Solomon was one of those sons. And he gave him, I believe it says at least 9 more kids. So it says in Jerusalem, in 1 Chronicles, it says in Jerusalem, David took more wives and became the father of more sons and daughters. And then they name some of their names. And then it says, we finish up in Chronicles 3:5-9. Verse 9, it said, all these were the sons of David, besides his sons by his concubines. So he had a lot more kids. And Tamar was their sister. So this is how we end this in 1 Chronicles with Tamar. Maybe we'll find out more about her tomorrow. We'll have to say if this video was a blessing to you, because that's how we're ending it today. I hope you take some stuff away from here that just gives you, I'm hoping, encouragement in your life, right? Not to give up if you are soaking in sin, or not to stand prideful in your sin and just say, oh, well, no big deal. So there are both ways to say it, right? God honors all of the ways that you come to him and deem him worthy. So, and give yourself over to him, right? So if this was a blessing, I want you to hit the like button. I want you to share this with other people and subscribe to the channel so it can continue to come back to you and you can be with me in this every day. Read your verses for tomorrow. Keep reading, guys, and I will see you next time.